Once regarded as one of America's most promising rehabilitation movements, Synanon completely dissolved after a process spanning more than 30 years. Its founder fell from grace, its leadership was prosecuted, the multi-million-dollar organization collapsed, and all that remained were abandoned buildings. But was that really the case? When a cult falls apart, does the story truly end? Or does the real story continue to live on in the lives of the people left behind? Even today, former Synanon members continue to speak about the trauma they experienced. Children who were born inside the cult are still trying to reclaim their childhoods. Meanwhile, researchers and journalists continue to cite Synanon as one of the most important examples for understanding modern cults. Even more interestingly, some of the methods developed by Synanon continue to exist for years under different names. The concept of tough love, behavior modification programs, and certain rehabilitation models are still debated today. In fact, many experts believe that Synanon's influence can still be seen in some modern cults and closed communities. So what exactly did Synanon leave behind? What are the survivors saying today? What lessons does this experience teach us? And how did a movement that began with good intentions transform into one of the world's most controversial cults? In this final chapter, we will examine not only the end of Synanon, but also the legacy it left behind. When Synanon officially dissolved in 1991, it left behind more than just a closed organization. It also left behind thousands of people who had spent some of the most important years of their lives within its structure. Even today, many surviving former Synanon members, children, and staff continue to share their experiences with the public. Their accounts are among the most important sources for understanding the history of Synanon. However, these people's stories are not all the same. While some say that Synanon saved their lives, a much larger number describe how they were unable to escape the effects of the psychological pressure, trauma, and systems of control they experienced for many years. Especially in recent years, documentaries, podcasts, and interviews have enabled many former Synanon members to speak publicly for the first time. Many of them say that when they first joined Synanon, they were genuinely looking for help. At the time, effective treatment options for people struggling with drug addiction in America were extremely limited. Synanon, with its disciplined structure and success stories, was seen as a promising alternative. However, over time, they say they realized that the community they had joined for rehabilitation had transformed into something entirely different. Among the experiences most commonly described by former members are living under constant surveillance, the gradual loss of individuality, pressure to give absolute obedience to the leadership, the severing of family ties, public humiliation, and the psychological pressure experienced during the game, the idea that leaving the organization was viewed almost as an act of betrayal. Many people say that after leaving Synanon, they struggled for years to build a normal life. According to experts, some of the psychological effects commonly observed in people who live closed, high control groups were also seen among former Synanon members. Some former members say they struggled with the following issues: regaining a sense of trust, being able to make independent decisions, building new social relationships, reconnecting with their families, and rebuilding their identities. For some, this process lasted only a few years, while others say they continue to feel the effects of their experiences for decades. At the same time, not all former members speak entirely negatively about Synanon. Some people who participated in the program during its early years say that Synanon helped them overcome drug addiction and rebuild their lives. However, Even these individuals often make an important distinction. They believe that the Synanon of the early years was not the same organization as the Synanon of later years. According to them, Charles Dederich's increasing authoritarianism and the organization's shift from rehabilitation to absolute obedience caused its original purpose to disappear completely. This view is also widely shared among historians. For many years, numerous former members did not speak publicly about their experiences. Among the reasons that are the trauma they endured, their reluctance to revisit the past, feeling of shame, and the belief that no one would believe them. However, documentaries and research published in recent years have, for the first time, provided many former members with a safe environment in which to speak. In particular, productions such as The Synanon Fix, Born in Synanon, and Sunshine Place allowed dozens of former members to describe their experiences in detail. Thanks to these testimonies, many previously unknown details about Synanon's history have come to light. Former Synanon members now live ordinary lives across different parts of America. Some share their experiences as writers, speakers, or counselors, while others choose to live entirely out of the public eye. Some have spent years volunteering with organizations that support people who have left cults, using their own experiences to help others. However, there is one point on which almost all of them agree. Even after leaving Synanon, the experiences they had there continue to affect them in different ways for the rest of their lives. Leaving the organization did not simply mean walking away from a building. People often had to leave behind the environment they had lived in for years, their friends, and in some cases even their families. One of Synanon's most striking characteristics was not that it encouraged people to join the organization, but that it made living extremely difficult. Many people who joined the program during its early years believed they could leave whenever they wanted. However, as Synanon gradually became a close, high-control community, living began to carry severe psychological and social consequences. Many former members say that leaving Synanon was the most difficult decision of their lives. Some former members say that the only way to leave was to escape without telling anyone, especially as the organization became more authoritarian during the late 1970s. Some people describe secretly leaving Synanon facilities in the middle of the night. The reason was not only that they believed they would be prevented from leaving. Some also feared they would be followed or threatened after they left. This fear became even stronger during the period when the organization displayed an aggressive attitude towards its critics. For many people who had left the organization, the greatest struggle was adapting to the outside world once again. People who had spent years making every decision according to Synanon's rules suddenly found themselves completely independent. Some did not know how to find a job, struggled to reconnect with their families, and said they were unable to trust anyone for a long time. Experts note that these experiences resemble the adjustment difficulties commonly observed among people living high-control groups. Interestingly, years later, some former Synanon members began reconnecting with one another. Through documentaries, podcasts, and research, former members found each other and realized that their experiences were not unique. For many, these reunions became an important part of the healing process because for the first time they had the opportunity to talk with people who understood what they had gone through and had shared similar experiences. It is also important to make an important distinction here. Synanon existed for nearly 30 years, and during that time it underwent significant changes. For that reason, The experience of someone who left in the early 1960s was not the same as that of someone who left in the late 1970s. While living was relatively easier during the early years, the cost of living increased as the organization became more authoritarian. For this reason, researchers emphasize that Synanon should be evaluated not as a single period, but through its different phases. The process was extremely difficult for adults who left Synanon. However, perhaps the heaviest price was paid by those who were born into the organization or brought there as children. They had never known what life outside was like. To them, Synanon was neither a rehabilitation center nor a cult. It was the only world in which they had been born and spent their childhood. During the 1970s, Charles Dederich began arguing that children should be raised by the community rather than by their biological families. As a result of this approach, many children were separated from their mothers and fathers, were raised in communal living areas, were cared for by designated caregivers, could see their parents only at certain times. According to Dederich, this method will help children become more independent individuals. However, former members and many of those children, now adults, say that instead caused serious emotional problems. One of the most common experiences described by former Synanon children is that they were unable to form secure attachments with their parents. In interviews conducted years later, some say they could not understand why their mothers were not with them, that they spent very little time with their fathers, and that they were unable to define the concept of family for a long time. According to child psychology experts, separation from parents at an early age can negatively affect the development of trust and healthy attachment. Children growing up in Synanon were not only separated from their families, they also lived in an environment governed by very strict rules. According to former tribe members, obedience was highly valued. Children who failed to follow the rules could be harshly criticized. Individual decision-making was not encouraged. The interests of the community were placed above those of the individual. Although the experiences of children varied from person to person, many former members say that this environment left them with long-lasting psychological effects. When Synanon dissolved or when their families left the organization, many children encountered ordinary life for the first time. Some attended public school for the first time, saw different ways of life, and began making their own decisions. However, this transition was not always easy because their experience of the outside world was extremely limited. Some say they felt like outsiders, while others describe struggling for years to form normal social relationships. For a long time, the stories of the children who grew up in Synanon were not widely known to the public. Many of them did not want to talk about what they had experienced. Others were only able to make sense of their experiences after becoming adults. Thanks to documentaries and podcasts released in recent years, the silence has largely been broken. Today, many former Synanon children have begun sharing their experiences in their own words. Some of those who grew up in Synanon now speak publicly as writers, speakers, or activists. Others work to raise awareness about childhood trauma and the effects of high control groups. In particular, productions such as The Synanon Fix, Born in Synanon, and The Sunshine Place, released in recent years, have brought their voices to a much wider audience. Thanks to their testimonies, not only the experiences of Synanon's adult members but also its impact on children has become much more visible. According to many researchers, Synanon's most enduring legacy is not the buildings or the financial structure it left behind, but the marks it left on the lives of these children. An organization may come to an end. However, the effects of childhood experiences often last a lifetime. For this reason, the story of Synanon is not only the story of the rise or fall of a cult, but also the story of the generations who grew up within it. It was not only the testimonies of former members and children that allowed us to understand the real nature of Synanon. Over the years, journalists and researchers also began examining the organization closely. What is interesting is that the public's perception of Synanon changed completely over time. The story of Synanon is one of the clearest examples of how the media's perception of a community can change completely over time. Over the course of nearly 30 years, newspapers, magazines, and television networks gradually described the same organization first as a promising rehabilitation model, then as a controversial community, and finally as a dangerous cult. This change did not happen overnight. It was the result of a long transformation that lasted nearly 20 years. Most of the news reports published about Synanon during the late 1950s and the 1960s were highly positive. At the time, the media focused particularly on the following topics: rehabilitating drug addicts back into society, Charles Chuck Dederich's unconventional approach, Synanon's success stories, the role of communal living in overcoming addiction. At the time when addiction treatment in America was still undeveloped, Synanon was viewed by many journalists as a bold social experiment. Some reports presented Synanon as a model that had succeeded where traditional rehabilitation centers had failed. By the early 1970s, the tone of the reporting began to change. Journalists were no longer telling only success stories. Instead, they began asking questions such as, why were members being separated from their families? Why could Dederic's decisions not be questioned? Was the game really a form of therapy? Why were forced divorces being carried out? Why were children being separated from their families? During this period, while some reports still defended Synanon, other journalists began writing that the organization was becoming increasingly closed off. The first serious public debates also began during this time. By the late 1970s, the language used by the media had changed noticeably. News reports were now focused less on rehabilitation successes and more on headlines such as armed security teams, threats against critics, testimonies from former members, tax investigations, acts of violence. The rattlesnake attack on Paul Morantz, in particular, became the most significant turning point in this shift. National newspapers and television networks no longer reported on Synanon merely as a controversial rehabilitation center, but as an organization that posed a risk to public safety. Many media researchers also viewed the Synanon case as an important lesson in journalism. During its early years, many news organizations repeated Synanon's claims of success without sufficiently questioning them. However, later investigative journalism exposed the enormous gap between the image the organization presented to the public and what was actually happening inside. For this reason, the Synanon case is regarded not only as the story of a cult but also a historical example demonstrating why critical journalism is so important. Synanon stands out not only as one of the most controversial communities in American history, but also as one of the real-life stories that has had significant influence on Hollywood and popular culture, especially in recent years as former members began sharing their testimonies. The story of Synanon was rediscovered and inspired numerous films, documentaries, podcasts, and television productions. However, Synanon's influence on popular culture can be seen in two different ways. The first consists of productions that directly tell the story of Synanon. The second consists of fictional stories inspired by Synanon without using its name. Synanon's influence is not limited to documentaries that directly portray it. Many screenwriters and producers had drawn inspiration from Synanon's story to create characters and organizations centered on high-control communities. The following themes in particular have been used repeatedly: a charismatic leader, communal living, psychological manipulation, separation from the outside world, group pressure, former members trying to escape. These themes have now become the basic building blocks of the cult stories that appear in many films and television series today. Although not all of these productions are directly about Synanon, researchers note that Synanon served as an important point of reference in development of these narratives. Today, the name Synanon is associated not only with a rehabilitation center, but also with charismatic leadership, group psychology, manipulation, absolute control, organizations that began with good intentions but gradually change over time. For this reason, Synanon is not merely an event confined to history books. It continues to be an example that filmmakers, journalists, psychologists, and writers still study today. And it appears that because of the questions it raises about human nature, it will continue to be discussed for many years to come. So, does the story of Synanon merely help us understand the past? Or does it also contain important lessons for today's rehabilitation centers, personal development programs, and life coaching organizations? The story of Synanon is not merely an extraordinary cult story from the past. It is also an important warning showing how an initiative that begins with good intentions can gradually turn into unchecked power. For this reason, many psychologists, addiction specialists, sociologists, and ethics researchers continue to study Synanon as a historical case. Its transformation demonstrates not only what can happen to an organization, but also the consequences of uncontrolled power and unquestioned authority. Let us examine these lessons one by one. First, good intentions alone are not enough. Synanon was indeed founded with the goal of helping people overcome drug addiction. During its early years, some people said that the program had helped them overcome their addiction. However, according to experts, the fact that an organization is founded with good intentions does not guarantee that it will continue to operate within ethical boundaries in the future. If an institution loses its transparency, rejects criticism, concentrates all decision-making in the hands of a single person, then no matter how noble its original purpose may have been, serious problems can eventually arise. Second, charismatic leadership must be subject to oversight. Researchers who study leadership today frequently cite Synanon as an example. Charles Dederich's greatest strength was not simply that he was an effective speaker. His real power came from the fact that, over time, members stopped questioning his decisions. For this reason, the following principle is considered extremely important in modern rehabilitation centers and psychological support programs. No leader should be greater than the institution itself. Decisions should be based not on the authority of a single individual, but on ethics committees, teams of professionals, and independent oversight. Third, psychological pressure is not therapy. One of Synanon's most controversial practices, the game, was presented as an therapeutic method for many years. Today, however, the overwhelming majority of mental health professionals state that humiliation, verbal abuse, and intense group pressure do not constitute an ethical form of therapy. Modern psychotherapy is built upon voluntary participation, trust, respect, scientific methods, the rights of the client. For this reason, many of the methods used by Synanon are not accepted in professional mental health practice today. Fourth, transparency and accountability. The Synanon case also demonstrated the importance of independent oversight. Today, reliable rehabilitation centers generally have government inspections, ethics committees, licensing processes, patient rights mechanisms, external audits. According to experts, these systems protect not only the institutions themselves, but also the people receiving their services. Fifth, the danger of the belief that the end justifies the means. Over time, the following idea became increasingly common within Synanon. If we are saving people, the methods we use do not matter. Historians believe that this mindset represented one of the organization's greatest turning points. It was used to justify forced divorces, the separation of children from their families, psychological pressure, violence. For this reason, Ethics experts today emphasize that a worthy goal can never justify unethical methods. Sixth, though similar risks exist today, experts say that not only rehabilitation centers but also some personal development programs, life coaching organizations, motivational camps, closed educational groups should be subject to proper oversight. This does not mean that all such programs are harmful. On the contrary, many rehabilitation centers and life coaching programs operate using scientific methods within ethical guidelines and in ways that make positive contributions to people's lives. However, the example of Synanon reminds us that caution is warranted whenever the following warning signs appear within any organization. The leader becomes unquestionable, criticism is suppressed, separation from the outside world is encouraged, members' private lives are subjected to excessive interference. The institution begins to see itself as above the law. These warning signs are considered indicators not only for cause but for any high-control organization. Perhaps the most important lesson left by Synanon is this: the success of an organization should be judged not only by how many people it helps, but also by how it helps them. Because when ethical principles and human rights are ignored, even a movement that begins with the very best intentions can eventually become the exact opposite of the purpose for which it was founded. Today, Synanon continues to be regarded not only as a failed cult, but also as a powerful cautionary example for experts who study rehabilitation, leadership, and group psychology. This is also why it's often mentioned alongside organizations such as Mansion Family, People Temple, Heaven's Gate, and Scientology, despite being completely different from them in many respects. Comparison with Manson family. The Manson family, founded by Charles Manson, was a small but highly radical group built around an apocalyptic belief system. Synanon, on the other hand, was not originally a religious movement but a drug rehabilitation center. Nevertheless, the two organizations share certain similarities. A charismatic and unquestioned leader, a strong psychological influence over members, isolation from the outside world, a us versus them mentality. Differences: the Manson family was a small group that turned to violence from the very beginning. Synanon, by contrast, operated for many years as a legally recognized rehabilitation center supported by the public, and violence became much more apparent only later, as its leadership became increasingly radical. Comparison with People's Temple. People's Temple, led by Jim Jones, also initially gained support through messages of social welfare and equality. In this respect, it bears considerable similarity to Synanon. Both organizations began with well-intentioned social goals, gradually evolved into leader-centered structures, became close to criticism, began controlling the private lives of their members. However, the greatest difference is that People's Temple became infamous because of the mass deaths that occurred in Johnstown, Guyana in 1978. Not such mass casualty event occurred in Synanon. For this reason, researchers emphasize that although the transformation process of the two organizations were similar, their outcomes were different. Comparison with Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate was a religious movement built around beliefs involving extraterrestrials and the apocalypse. Synanon, by contrast, had no religious doctrine. Nevertheless, they shared several common characteristics: the leader's absolute authority, group identity taking precedence over individual identity, the outside world being portrayed as wrong or dangerous, detailed control over members' lifestyles. The most significant difference is that Heaven's Gate was based entirely on a religious and apocalyptic worldview. Synanon, on the other hand, began as a rehabilitation movement and gradually evolved into a secular high-control community. Comparison with Scientology. Perhaps the comparison made most often is with Scientology. Although the two organizations emerged for entirely different reasons, Researchers point to the following similarities: a charismatic founding leader, strong organizational discipline, a hardline attitude towards critics, legal and social conflicts with former members, strong group loyalty. However, there are also important differences. Scientology is an international organization that continues to operate today and defines itself as a religion. Synanon was not a religious movement and officially dissolved in 1991. For this reason, it would not be accurate to place the two organizations in exactly the same category. Researchers who study cults note that many of these organizations display a number of recurring characteristics: a strong and charismatic leader, the leader gradually becoming unquestionable, group identity taking precedence over the individual, suppression of criticism, creating distrust of the outside world, controlling members' social circles. Although these characteristics are not present to the same degree in every organization, they form similar patterns across many high-control groups. Synanon began in 1958 as a small rehabilitation community and, over the course of several decades, became one of the most controversial organizations in American history. Throughout this series, we have seen how an idea can be born, how it can grow, and how it can ultimately spiral out of control. A movement that began with the hope of overcoming drug addiction, a charismatic leader, absolute loyalty, psychological control, violence, courtrooms, and in the end, an inevitable collapse. Yet Synanon's true legacy does not live on in its abandoned buildings or its sort of properties. It continues to live on in the lives of the people who were affected by the organization. Perhaps the most important message of this documentary is this: no cult in history claims that it was founded with the intention of harming people. Most emerged with the promise of making the world a better place. What ultimately makes the difference is not their stated goals, but how they use power over time, how they respond to criticism, and how they treat people. If you found this 5-part documentary series on Synanon informative, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll be among the first to know when we release new documentaries and true case file. Thank you for watching. See you in the next documentary.